Okay, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the workshop. This is Leslie Scott, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. I am the Technical Assistance Lead for the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest, and I want to welcome everyone to Session 1 of REL Midwest's Survey Methods webinar series in the pursuit of reliable data using surveys in early childhood research. Now, your speaker for today is Dr. Anne-Marie Faria. You can see her beautiful face there on the screen. Anne-Marie is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research with over a decade of experience conducting applied research in early childhood education settings. And she holds a PhD in developmental psychology. Now, a little fun fact about Anne-Marie is that she is a former kindergarten teacher. Now I'd like to begin today's session with a brief overview of the Regional Education Laboratory program, telling you a bit more about who we are and what we do. So on this next screen, you can see the chart of the United States and how the nation is cut up in 10 regional education laboratories that are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. REL Midwest, I guess it's a dark inky blue in the center, serves the educational needs of Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin, and it's administered by the American Institute for Research. The location for the home base for REL Midwest is 2 offices in the Chicago region, one downtown Chicago, Illinois, and then another out in Naperville, Illinois. I don't know, Anne-Marie, who will be, I'll change my own slides. Okay. Now the REL Midwest charge is to improve students' academic outcomes by helping states, school districts, and schools systematically use data, conducting and supporting high-quality research and evaluation, and promoting evidence-based decision-making. Now in short, REL Midwest helps educators and policymakers expand their knowledge and understanding of research and its value to decision-making and education reform. I was thinking it was So the REL, I'm going to give you a little bit more information about the research alliances that the REL Midwest oversees. All regional educational laboratories conduct their work through research alliances. And research alliances are member groups that bring together practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and others to address shared high-priority education research issues through collaboratively working all together based on the use and using empirical data and evidence. REL Midwest has 8 active research alliances, and here's the list of the 8 research alliances, of which one is the Early Childhood Education Research Alliance. This webinar is being hosted by REL Midwest's Early Childhood Education Research Alliance. Now these 8 research alliances address 4 priority education areas: college and career readiness, early childhood education, educator effectiveness, and low-performing schools, school improvement. Again, today's event was developed in collaboration with the REL Midwest's Early Childhood Research Alliance. And I'd like to just direct you to the REL Midwest, REL Midwest website. Here's a URL for our website. And on the website, you can find a host of resources and information, links to resources and publications, research alliances, the members of the different research alliances, and what their different charges are, information about upcoming events, access to archived events, and we've actually, IES has actually come into the 21st century, and you can follow us on Twitter at REL Midwest. Now, before we actually get started and I introduce Anne-Marie to you all over again, I'd like to just go over a few of the webinar features with you and do a little house cleaning here. We would love to hear, throughout this webinar, we would love to hear from you, your thoughts, If you have questions, let us know. If there's something that you'd like us to clarify, also let us know. And the way that you can communicate to us is through the chat box or chat pod, which is on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. It looks like a lot of you have already, you probably have participated in a lot of webinars already, and so you know how to use this. But also a lot of people today have already used this chat pod. Instructions, if you've not done that, if you've not used a chat pod before, just type your message or question in the narrow rectangular box on the bottom of the chat pod, and then click that little dialogue bubble to the right of your message. Or you can just hit the return key on your keyboard, and your message will come up to the screen. And hopefully we won't be so absorbed in our presentation of the material today, we will be able to stop and answer your questions. Again, as I said, we'd like you to post your questions, and it could be substantive questions on the material that we're presenting, or even please let us know if you're having any trouble whatsoever with sound, webinar tool assistance, other technical issues. And we have somebody that's just focused on addressing those technical issues immediately. Again, post your questions for the presenter in the chat pod, and we will answer them during the session or at the end during a question and answer session. Also, please feel free to share your stories and insights. Go ahead and type in, oh my God, that's happened to me, or I didn't know that, or that's a great example of how to write a survey question. This is kind of the same issue. There's only one bullet on this slide that really is different, and that is, I don't think it is. This is a completely repeated slide. So here, I'd also like to let you know that during the course of this presentation, we will be presenting material on developing sound surveys. And scattered throughout the presentation, we are going to be asking you to respond through polls, very similar to the poll that you had responded to when you first entered into the webinar. And then we will also have a couple of multiple choice questions that we're going to ask you, and we can see everyone's responses in real time. So that being said, I think we can actually get to the meat of the webinar, and I am going to present to you Anne-Marie Faria, and she will take you through developing a survey.
All right, thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you everyone for taking some time this afternoon to join us and to think through what it takes to conduct a survey in early childhood education settings. As you all probably know, there are 2 sessions to this workshop series. Today's session will focus on 4 topics, and they are planning for a survey, as well as using existing survey items, how to write and create your own new survey items, and then finally, once you have a set of items for your survey, thinking through ways that you can test those items in the field before you go live. Those will be the topics for today. So really this is the prep session. And tomorrow's session, led by Dr. Laura Hawkinson, we'll be talking more about actually how you administer a survey. So questions about sampling and data collection. So right now, I'd love to just hear from you all about your interest in those 4 topics today. So this is our first polling activity, and we'd like to know if you are most interested in learning more today about how to plan for a survey, how to leverage existing items, how to write new items, or how to pre-test items in the field. So if you wouldn't mind just clicking on the options here in the poll, and we can get a sense for people's interests to guide our work together today. And I'll just give everyone a minute or 2. And Sonika, I don't know if you could make that just a little bit bigger so we could see the 4th option, pre-testing items. To see if anyone's choosing that. There we go. All right, so it looks like most folks are interested in planning for a survey as well as writing new items. So we'll just start right off the bat here with some information about things to consider when you're actually planning for a survey. So Sonika, I think, thank you. Go ahead and close the poll. So one thing that you need to think about when you're going to conduct a survey is whether or not a survey is actually the best way to collect the information that you want to hear. So a survey can produce quantitative descriptions of the characteristics or attributes or attitudes or perceptions of a group of people or a population. But there are lots of other ways that we could collect information, such as conducting interviews or potentially focus groups with groups of people, or maybe going into classrooms or programs and observing what's happening between teachers and children, or also analyzing data that you already have in hand. So one of those first decisions is whether or not a survey is the right tool for you. And a survey will tell you what's happening or how much something is happening. But an interview can be useful when you really want to understand the how or the why behind things. So as we work through today, I can give you an example. So a survey would tell you if this teacher, here in this image, attended a training on, let's say, first aid or CPR, and the teacher can complete the survey and tell you, yes, I attended that training. But the interview would let you understand a bit more about why she chose that training when she had many others to choose from. So thinking about whether the survey is the method that you'd like to use. Just as a review, interviews, as I mentioned before, are suitable to investigate complex topics in depth, and you can really get into the how and why, and not just the what. Focus groups are interesting because they allow you to actually understand group interaction around a certain idea or question. So rather than just having one person sit at their computer or at their desk and complete a survey, focus groups typically include 8 to 10 people, and you may get different information because of that group interaction. Observations are also useful if you want to collect data really about people's behaviors or practices. Sometimes it's difficult to get people to tell you what they do on a survey, and observations can sometimes provide more accurate or unbiased information about behaviors. And then a final option that may be more cost-effective than creating a brand new survey and administering it is to use the data that is already collected. And we do know that there are challenges in the early childhood education field when it comes to existing data sources, but we also know that we're moving forward. And so there may be other sources of data that already exist that you could use to answer your research questions. So those are just some things that you should consider before you decide that a survey is the right tool for you. Let's spend a little bit of time thinking about what happens way before you have a survey item. And one of the very first things when you're beginning a project is to set clear research goals and also to set clear research questions. So first we'd start with the broad goals of the project. So what are the goals? What do you want to learn from the survey results? And it may be slightly specific, such as describing current practices in the field. So how many teachers across the state of Iowa in center-based care currently hold a bachelor's degree? That could be a research goal. A goal could be to understand the educational capacity of the workforce. But surveys could also be used to evaluate the outcomes of programs or initiatives, or also to document attitudes or perceptions. And so when you're thinking about the broad research goals, some things to consider are the availability of funds. Is there enough money to really meet your research goals? And what's the time frame? You know, are there questions that need to be answered next week versus a couple of months from now versus a year from now? Because research projects are typically a little bit slower than we want them to be, and thinking about that time frame is important when you're planning for a survey. With whom will the findings be shared? Is this information that will be collected to be shared with practitioners or with policymakers? And finally, what are the actions or decisions that the survey results can inform? And this is really a big part of defining your research goals. So if you can clarify the actions or decisions that you want to make based on the results from the survey, it will often lead you to very clear research goals. So perhaps the information or the decisions you'd like to make are, should we spend more resources to encourage child development home providers to participate in coaching through CCR&Rs? And if that's the big picture decision that you're trying to make, that can inform your research goal. Another example or a tip in figuring out what is your broad research goal is to begin with actually writing the survey findings. So what would you hope to say in your final report? Or what would you like to say to the state level policymakers? And here are just a couple of examples. Perhaps you'd like to say that 90% of teachers report that they refer to the early learning standards at least weekly for planning their literacy instruction. Or perhaps you have a different target, and maybe it's 50% of child development home providers report that travel time is a barrier to quality improvement activities. If you take the time and you sit down and you write out what you'd like the findings to report, that can really help you set clear research goals at the beginning stage of survey planning. So here's an example from a research project that we're currently conducting with the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest. This is a project in Michigan focused on their quality rating and improvement system that's called the Great Start to Quality. And these are the two broad research goals that we co-developed with the state to really guide the work that we'd be doing together. So the first goal, as you can see here, is to document the distribution of quality rating and improvement system ratings in early child care programs in Michigan. So understanding how many 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s we have in QRIS ratings across the state. And then the second goal is to provide information to Michigan and to other states about possible alternative approaches for calculating those quality ratings within a QRIS. And so you can see these are big picture goals here, documenting the distribution and providing information about alternative options. I think we'll pause here just for a second and get a little bit of information from you before we jump into the difference between research goals and research questions about your own experience and expertise with conducting surveys. So we'd like to hear from you about how experienced you consider yourself with working with survey research methods. So very experienced, somewhat, or really no experience yet in survey methods. Somewhat. All right, it looks like most people are landing in that somewhat experienced bucket, which is a really good place to be for today's workshop. And we're hoping we can nudge you up a little bit more with the information that we shared today. Okay, we'll give folks just a couple more minutes. Thank you. All right, so let's talk now for a minute about the difference between research goals, which are those broad, big pictures, goals that guide the project, versus research questions. Again, before you develop a survey, you should really spend time thinking about the goals and the questions to be answered. So research questions should describe what you want to know and about whom. They should be more specific than the research goals that you've developed. And in fact, you might find that to actually complete the research goal, you might need multiple research questions. Okay? So when you're writing research questions, you want to make sure that they're questions that can actually be answered by survey data. And we talked about a couple of, in the beginning, the differences between information you gather from surveys versus information from interviews or focus groups or observations. And so making sure that your research questions are answerable is really quite important. And you do want to spend time preparing and gaining consensus on these questions because they should guide the work as you move forward together. So here's an example following that REL Midwest Michigan project on the QRIS. There are repeated at the top both of our broad research goals for this project, and then underneath there were 4 research questions that we co-created with the state to help us meet our research goals. So these first 3 questions actually all align to the first goal. So how many programs are rated as low, moderate, and high quality under Michigan's QRIS version 1.0? And then the second one, how consistent are the self-ratings and the independent observations under Michigan's QRIS version 1.0? So you can see that the research questions are much more specific, and they really target in on what we're trying to understand and with whom, whereas the goal is much broader. The last research question here on slide 28 actually aligns to the second goal. So we asked, how do the distributions of self-ratings and final ratings under Michigan's QRIS change with alternative approaches to calculating ratings. And so you can see that to meet our 2 research goals, we actually needed at least 4 research questions, and I'm sure we could have developed more. So if we look at the research questions that were developed in this example project, you can see that you really need to pick apart all of the words that you put into a research question, and you need to think through each term and construct that you put in your research question. So for example, if we look at that first question, how many programs are rated as low, moderate, and high quality in Michigan's QRIS version 1.0, we need to make sure that everyone understands which programs are included. So are we talking about just programs that participate in the QRIS? Are we talking about just programs with current published scores? Or those that have begun the process but aren't yet rated? Are we talking about programs that participated 2 years ago but now are no longer participating? These are all decisions that need to be made early on when you're planning for the survey to make sure that there's consensus across your research group as you move forward. Another key construct or term that's in here is low, moderate, and high quality. So what do we mean by low, moderate, and high quality? Defining that up in the beginning when you're planning for the survey can help you understand how you will group programs. And then what does it mean to be in Michigan's QRIS version 1.0? So the version 1.0 here is really interesting because Michigan recently changed their system. So we had to be quite specific in our research questions if we were talking about version 1.0 or the revised version 2.0. So this is just one example of how you need to be very careful about the words that you choose for your research questions. So then the next step in planning for your survey is to think about who should actually take the survey. And one way to make this decision is to think about the end again, right? So when you're thinking about that final report or the briefing to the policymakers, would you like to make statements about what's happening with children, with families, with teachers, with directors or owners, with coaches, with programs? Who is it that you would like to speak about at the end stage? That can inform who should actually take the survey. So I'm going to put a research question up here in poll number 4 and ask you to take a guess at who you think should take the survey and what is our unit of analysis, that's the group that we would like to take the survey, for the following research question. The research question is, does coaching change teacher knowledge of literacy instruction in center-based care? And feel free to just take a guess. We haven't talked much about the unit of analysis yet. And I appreciate the 1 brave person, the 4 brave people, thank you, who have completed this. So some people are saying perhaps the unit of analysis is teachers, others may say it's programs. We'll give folks just a couple more minutes to take some guesses. Okay, so the majority of people here do say that it's teachers. And I would agree with the idea that in this research question, it is teachers. However, there are lots of different people that you could gather information from to answer any one research question. So those of you who chose programs, that's not incorrect. When you look at this next slide, if we look at the question in a different way, what is the quality of coaching across Iowa? If that was our research question, there were lots of people we could talk to. So we could ask coaches to self-report on their own behaviors and their own performance and let us know how they think they're doing. We could have teachers tell us about their satisfaction with their coaches. We could have programs and program directors report on whether they think the coaching is working for their staff. And so deciding who's the best person or potentially group of people to report on and answer your research question is really an interesting question. And sometimes you may actually need multiple respondents and therefore multiple surveys to get a really nice complete answer to your research question.